How did Eddie Howe outsmart Enzo Maresca? Newcastle had a tactical plan and Chelsea walked straight into it. In this episode, we'll deep dive into the tactical switch that caught Chelsea completely off guard, the glaring Chelsea weakness that Newcastle exposed time and time again, and how the potential player of the season for Newcastle dominated this game against Chelsea. And we'll analyse how this result impacts the race for the Champions League places. And this wasn't just a win. It could be the 3 points that secures Champions League football for Newcastle United next season and dealt Chelsea a massive blow to their hopes. But we have to start with the clever tactical switch from Eddie Howe that Chelsea couldn't solve even with 11 men. Now Newcastle had injuries to Joe Linton, Trippier, Joe Willock and a long-term absentee in Lewis Hall, which meant that Eddie Howe had to think of a new plan. Now he could have still kept the back four shape, Dan Burn at left back and Tino Livramento at right back, but he realised the best way to beat this Chelsea team is to let them have the ball. Newcastle played 5 at the back and 4 in midfield. They're used to doing this in big games and this was a big game. And Jacob Murphy played in an unorthodox right wing back position. He's used to doing it out of possession, but he also did it in possession. And I'll show you why that's important later on. And although they wanted Chelsea to have the ball, Newcastle always start with a high press. They attempt to unsettle the opposition, start fast, be aggressive, get into them as Eddie Howe says. And you can see from this still, Chelsea set up with their 3 at the back with Colwill, Cucurella and Chalobah, and Sanchez playing as a sort of unorthodox centre-back in their build-up. And then they had the double pivot of Lavia and Caicedo, a newer tactic in recent games, moving in from that right-back spot. But as Sanchez plays this ball to Colwill, it triggers the press. And Isak is on his bike, presses the middle centre-back, and you can see the limited options that Colwill has on the ball. He passes it back to Sanchez. Isak curves his run and he's able to limit that passing option back to Colwill, and Sanchez has to go long. It's too tricky, it's too dangerous to play short, especially in the early parts of the game against Newcastle, and it goes long and you can see the man marking press in effect. You see the middle centre back of Botman tracking Jackson, and then Fabian Schär and Dan Burn getting close to the box number 10s of Enzo Fernandez and Cole Palmer. Now Newcastle got their first goal from this high press, which we'll analyse a little bit later on, but when they dropped into that deep 5-4-1 formation with that 1-0 lead, they were so difficult to break down. And they know that allowing Chelsea the ball in front of them was much more easier to deal with than that transition game that Chelsea love to play. And they set up with that 4 in midfield, very narrow. And the aim is to restrict that space in that central area, prevent any balls being played into Cole Palmer, Nicholas Jackson and Enzo Fernandez when he drifted in there. And then they had that 5 at the back to deal with the width of Chelsea, but also have a spare centre back in case any runs were made by Jackson or the number 10s in behind. And you can see as Enzo Fernandez has the ball in front of that midfield line, Cole Palmer has drifted away from Dan Burn, trying to find that space in between that midfield and defensive line. But watch what Fabian Schär does. Fabian Schär is ready to get tight to Cole Palmer if he's to receive the ball in between that midfield and defensive line. But that creates a little gap in between Jacob Murphy and Sven Botman. And that would usually be a problem if you have 4 at the back. But because of that comfort blanket of an additional centre back, Botman's in a perfect position to track the run. And then there's no real option for Enzo Fernandez. And Chelsea actually end up recycling this ball with a little bit of pressure from Newcastle all the way back to Robert Sanchez. And this is where Chelsea struggle to penetrate those deep blocks. And if you look at the attacking momentum, the threat from both teams before that red card in the first half, Newcastle dominated Chelsea. The high press worked effectively at the start of the game, and then when they dropped deeper into that deep block, they really restricted Chelsea from having any real threat on goal. Now Chelsea managed to claw back their momentum in the second half, even with 10 men. I think that was mainly down to the tactical tweaks of Enzo Maresca, but also the mentality shift. I don't think Newcastle were ready to switch to playing against 10 men. Should they push for that second goal or should they maintain what they have? And it led to a bitty, gritty second half. But that 5 at the back worked perfectly, especially in that first half and especially for that first goal. And if you've watched any of my previous Chelsea analysis, one of the biggest weaknesses in this Enzo Maresca team is how they defend crossing situations. They attempt to hold that line on the edge of the box as long as possible, and there's a huge amount of space to be exploited if you can get early crosses into the box. As I said earlier, Newcastle pressed high in the early part of that game, and it worked, especially for this first goal. Lavia was caught on the ball by Tonali, and Tonali plays it into Bruno's feet, and this is where you see the benefit of playing a right wing back, especially Jacob Murphy in that position, rather than pushing him up high as a right winger. He's able to arrive late, not really being marked well by the winger in Madueke, and then the positioning of Barnes is actually quite key as well. Throughout the game, he was putting himself close to Cucurella and preventing him from being able to push out to Jacob Murphy when he got the ball. And in this situation, as Bruno plays it out wide, he has time and space to play the ball into the box. And because of how high Chelsea's defensive line initially was, there's a lot of space for Jacob Murphy to play this ball into. Tonali and Bruno make deep runs into the box. Caicedo, playing as a right back, not his usual position, sleeps for just a fraction, and Tonali sneaks in at the back post and finishes with a little bobbly finish, but it's a perfect start for Newcastle, exploiting that crossing situation that Chelsea just can't deal with this season. Even with the early goal, the dominant start to the game, and the red card, the second half was a nervy one, but there was one player that stepped up to the plate, and that was Dan Burn. And there were two key moments that showed just how important Dan Burn was, especially in that second half. And the first one was his tackle on Neto. And you can see Caicedo progressing with the ball and slips it in behind for Neto's run. And this is the kind of situation that Dan Burn has struggled with in the past against those pacey wingers. But he recovers well, reads the passing triggers, and makes a last-ditch sliding tackle, and he wins a goal kick for Newcastle. The reaction after winning that tackle, geeing up the crowd, and just getting them involved in what was a nervy start to that second half. But he ended the second half even better. Free kick for Newcastle, Dan Burn calling for it. He won that long ball airily for him to head it, but it's just a ball that switched over to him to his feet. But he adjusts really well, takes it down, and then he makes a lovely little inside pass into Bruno's feet. But it's what he does after that. You know, he gets an assist, but it's the assist without the ball that's just as important. He makes that run in behind Neto, drags him away from Bruno, but he also occupies the mind of Gusto, who's unable to get tight to Bruno as quickly as he wants to. And that allows just a bit of space for Bruno to cut inside and have a shot on goal, which deflects into the top right-hand corner, and it secures the win for Newcastle. But that all-round play from Dan Burn, both from a defensive perspective and what he done on the ball, was vital for Newcastle securing the 3 points. And if you look at the race for the Champions League places, Newcastle's home form has been vital for them jumping up to third position. They've beaten Chelsea, Forest, Aston Villa and Arsenal at home and drawn to Man City and Liverpool. And if they get one more win, they got Everton at home at the end of the season, they've probably secured Champions League for next season. And if you look at the rest of the teams chasing the Champions League place, it's all about momentum. Arsenal will probably beat Southampton away and potentially get a point at least against Newcastle and secure a Champions League place. Newcastle I can see getting at least one more win in the final 2 games. Man City have tricky games. Tricky teams to face at this stage of the season in Bournemouth and Fulham, but they probably will secure that Champions League place. And that leaves Chelsea, Aston Villa and Nottingham Forest fighting for that final Champions League place. And as I said, it's all about momentum. And Chelsea have lost 6 of their last 9 away games. Only Leicester and Southampton have a worse record than them, and they go to Nottingham Forest on the final day of the season. But Nottingham Forest also are struggling for momentum. Picking up a draw against Leicester at home is a poor result at this stage of the season. They seem to be struggling a little bit mentally with the pressure of trying to secure a Champions League place. Personally, I think Aston Villa will jump in and secure that 5th spot. I don't think Spurs or Man United will put up much of a fight, especially at this stage of the season with the Europa League final coming up. And I think Chelsea would drop points, potentially at Nottingham Forest. And Nottingham Forest seem like they're just struggling for that momentum to try and catch Aston Villa in that final game of the season. So I think it'll end up with Arsenal, Newcastle, Man City and Aston Villa in that top 5. But this game was pivotal and Newcastle picked up a vital 3 points against Chelsea. If you enjoyed this analysis, make sure to check out one of my other videos up here that I'll link up next. And I'll see you on the next episode of A Game in 2 Halves.